The morning Mamie Lockhart found the foreclosure notice tucked beneath her front door. The sun had not yet crested the red canyon walls east of Redemption Creek, and the world was still painted in the bruised purple shades of a Texas dawn that did not know yet how cruel the day would become. She stood in the doorway of the farmhouse her father had built board by board with his own two hands, her bare feet on the cold pine planks, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she read the words twice because the first time her eyes simply refused to believe them. The notice was from the First Territorial Bank of Redemption Creek, signed by one Harlan Pruitt, bank manager, and as most folks in the county knew, a man who enjoyed wielding power the way other men enjoyed a good meal. The document stated, in language so formal and cold it might have been carved from stone, that the outstanding loan balance on the Lockhart property, totaling $432, was due in full no later than the 15th of October, 1882. It was already the 12th. Mamie pressed her back against the doorframe and let her eyes travel across the land her father had loved. The dry grass stretched out golden beneath the early light, and the little creek that ran along the property's eastern edge caught what thin silver of moon still lingered above the horizon. There were 40 acres here, 40 acres of grazing land, a small vegetable garden that her mother had planted before the fever took her, a modest barn housing 2 horses, a milk cow named Bess, and a dozen laying hens that Mamie had named individually and spoke to every morning as though they could understand her. This land was not just property. It was every memory she had ever made, every grief she had ever survived, and every small hope she still carried. Her father, Thomas Lockhart, had died the previous winter from a lung sickness that had crept in after 3 weeks of working the fence line in the freezing rain. He had left Mamie the farm, the horses, and a debt he had told her was nearly paid off. What he had not told her, because he had not wanted to worry her, was that he had taken a second loan to cover the cost of new fence posts and seed grain after the drought of 1880 had nearly broken him. That second loan had been quietly accumulating interest, and Harlan Pruitt, who had extended it with a smile that Mamie now understood had never reached his eyes, had been perfectly content to let the interest stack up like firewood until the pile was high enough to bury someone under. She folded the notice carefully, because unfolding it and reading it a third time seemed like something that might break her, and she went back inside to make coffee she knew she would not be able to drink. Chester Warren had been riding toward Redemption Creek since before sunset the previous evening, and he was the kind of tired that settled into the bones rather than the muscles, the kind that came from 3 weeks of driving cattle up from the Rio Grande and sleeping on hard ground under harder stars. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean in the way that men who live outdoors tend to be lean, not because of any particular effort, but because the land simply does not allow for softness. His hat was dark with trail dust, and his jaw carried several days of stubble the same dark brown as his hair. And his horse, a roan gelding he called Copper for no reason more complicated than the color of his coat, moved through the early morning with the patient exhaustion of an animal that trusted his rider to know when rest was coming. Chester had grown up in Redemption Creek, or just outside it on a small property his father had worked as a horse breeder, until a bad winter and a string of bad decisions had reduced that property to a memory. His father had died when Chester was 19, leaving nothing but a good name and a saddle that Chester still used, and Chester had gone to work for the Hargrove Ranch doing what he did best, which was riding and working cattle and being honest about what he knew and what he did not. He had been with Hargrove's outfit for 9 years now, and he was well regarded, well paid by trail standards, and almost entirely without a place to call his own. He had money saved. More money than most men in his position allowed themselves to accumulate, because Chester Warren had never been particularly tempted by card tables or saloon whiskey or the other pleasures that tended to separate working men from their wages in cattle towns. He had a figure in his head, a quiet number that he checked against his savings every few months like a man checking the level of water in a well. And he was nearly at it. Nearly at the point where he could think about something permanent. Something with a roof and a fence line and perhaps, if he allowed himself the full shape of the thought, someone to share it with. He had known Mamie Lockhart for most of his life in the way that people know each other in small western towns, which is to say he had watched her grow from a girl who used to sit on the top rail of her father's fence, watching the cattle drives go past into a woman who managed that same farm with a quiet competence that he had admired from the respectful distance a man maintains when he is not sure his admiration is welcome. He had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in the past 3 years, at the general store, at the church social in the spring, once at the feed merchant's when they had both been waiting on the same order, and had spent 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular, which Chester had replayed in his mind enough times that he could have recited it word for word. He knew she was alone now. Word traveled fast in small territories, and the news of Thomas Lockhart's death had reached him on the trail in February, by way of a rider passing through, who knew Chester had connections in Redemption Creek. He had sent a letter of condolence to Mamie through the post, a short and somewhat awkward letter because Chester was not a man who found words easy when they needed to carry feeling, and he had not known whether she had received it or what she had thought of it if she had. He rode into the edge of town, just as the sky was turning the particular shade of pink that precedes real sunrise, and he was passing the alley beside Drummond's hardware store when he heard two voices speaking in the kind of low, conspiratorial tone that men use when they believe no one is around to hear them. Chester was a man who had spent years on trail drives learning to pay attention to things that did not quite fit the expected shape of a moment, and those two voices did not fit the expected shape of a pre-dawn morning in a quiet town. He did not stop Copper or make any obvious movement of attention, but he slowed his pace to the most casual walk the gelding could manage and let his ears do the work. "Prout wants it done by the 15th, one voice said. It was a man Chester did not immediately recognize, slightly nasal, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who spent more time indoors than out. "The woman hasn't got the money," the second voice replied. This one Chester knew. It belonged to Deckard Sims, who worked as a clerk at the First Territorial Bank and who had a reputation for carrying information out of that institution the way a leaky bucket carries water. Prout's already had the transfer papers drawn up. Once the bank takes the property, he's selling it to Aldrich for the railroad survey land. "That's the Lockhart place," the first voice asked. "That's the one. Girl's been out there alone since her father passed." Prout let the second note ride long enough that she'd never be able to cover it all at once. "He's been planning this since January." Chester did not stop moving. He rode past the alley at that same unhurried pace and turned Copper down the next street before he allowed himself to absorb what he had just heard. The Lockhart place. Mamie Lockhart. A debt manufactured into a trap by a bank manager who wanted the land for a railroad deal and had used a dead man's loan to get it. He sat still in the saddle for a moment in the empty street, Copper breathing steadily beneath him, and he felt something move through his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained elements of both, sharpened by something else entirely, something that had to do with a woman sitting on a fence rail watching cattle drives, and a 20-minute conversation about nothing in particular that he had never forgotten. He knew what $432 meant. He knew because he had that number in his savings and a little more. He had been saving it for something permanent. He had been saving it for a future he could only half picture because one crucial element of it remained undefined. And he sat in the pre-dawn street of Redemption Creek and looked at the undefined element, and suddenly it had a face. Chester Warren turned Copper toward the stable, unsaddled him, made sure the horse had water and grain, and then walked with his trail-dusted boots and his 3 weeks of road weariness to the Redemption Creek branch of the Cattlemen's Savings Institution, which was not the First Territorial Bank, and which was where Chester kept his money, and he sat down on the step outside it to wait for it to open. The Cattlemen's Savings Institution opened at 7:30 in the morning, and Chester was the first person through the door. The teller, a young man named Floyd who had not finished waking up yet, looked at Chester's dusty appearance with mild alarm before Chester removed his hat, set it on the counter, and explained in a calm and level voice what he needed. He needed to withdraw $450 in full from his account, which Floyd confirmed was possible, and he needed it in denomination that could be presented to another banking institution as full payment on a loan. Floyd, who was beginning to understand that something serious was happening, fetched the institution's manager without being asked, and the manager, a fair and practical man named Cornelius Hatch, came out of his back office still buttoning his vest and listened to what Chester needed. Cornelius Hatch had been in Redemption Creek long enough to know Harlan Pruitt's methods, and he had been in banking long enough to recognize when a man was trying to outrun a deliberate injustice. He processed Chester's withdrawal with the kind of efficient personal attention that the situation seemed to demand, and when Chester walked out of the Cattlemen's Savings Institution at 8 o'clock in the morning with $450 in a sealed envelope and a receipt that would stand up to any legal scrutiny, Hatch watched him go with an expression that was partly professional satisfaction and partly something it would have embarrassed him to name. The First Territorial Bank opened at 8:30. Chester was standing outside it when the door was unlocked by a young employee who looked startled to find someone already waiting. Chester walked in, asked to see Harlan Pruitt, and was told that Mr. Pruitt was not in the office yet. Chester sat down in the waiting area and waited. Mamie had managed, by 8 o'clock, to drink half a cup of coffee and feed the chickens and milk Bess, and tell herself approximately 11 times that she would think of something, without once successfully completing the thought of what that something might be. She had $48 saved in the tin box under her floorboard, which was the total of a year's careful management of the farm's small income, and $48 against 432 was not a number that offered comfort no matter how she arranged it. She had considered riding into town and speaking to Harlan Pruitt directly, asking for more time, asking for a payment arrangement, but she knew Harlan Pruitt by reputation well enough to understand that the kindness he had shown her father when extending that second loan had been strategic rather than genuine, and that going to him now with nothing but desperation would accomplish nothing. She was standing at the fence line looking at the creek when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She turned, shading her eyes against the now fully risen sun, and watched a rider come up the road toward her property. The horse was a roan she did not immediately recognize, but the rider, as he came closer, resolved himself into a shape she knew, and her heart did something complicated and unexpected. Chester Warren pulled Copper up at her gate and took off his hat and said, "Morning, Miss Lockhart." His voice was the same as she remembered it, steady and unhurried, like a river that has decided what direction it is going. Mamie looked at him and thought, with the irrational clarity that sometimes accompanies a moment of crisis, that he looked both exhausted and determined in a way that was difficult to separate from handsome. "Chester Warren," she said, "you look like you rode through the night." "Most of it," he agreed. He looked at her for a moment in the direct way that had always made Mamie feel seen rather than examined, which was a distinction she had turned over in her mind more than once. "I need to speak to you about something. May I come in?" She opened the gate and he dismounted and tied Copper to the post and followed her up to the porch, where she poured him a cup of the coffee she had been struggling with, and he drank half of it standing before he sat down. He looked at the tin mug in his hands for a moment as though composing a sentence, and then he looked up at her. "I came through town this morning before the banks opened," he said. "I heard something I probably wasn't meant to hear, about a loan, about this property." Mamie went very still. The foreclosure notice was still folded on the kitchen table inside, and the specific quality of Chester's expression told her that whatever he had heard was not different from what she already knew. Proots had it planned, Chester said. He told her what he had overheard, the railroad deal, the deliberate accumulation of interest, Aldrich's involvement, all of it, and he watched her face as she processed it, watched the fear and the fury move through her in successive waves, and he did not look away because he felt she deserved someone to look at her directly when the full shape of the injustice was laid out. He manufactured it, Mamie said quietly when Chester finished. It was not a question. That's how it looks to me, Chester said. He let your father take the second loan knowing the interest would climb out of reach. Your father wouldn't have understood the compounding rate. Most people don't. Mamie set down her coffee cup very carefully on the porch railing. My father worked this land for 20 years, she said. He built this house. He dug that well with a hand shovel and a prayer and 3 weeks of blistered palms. She paused. $432. He is going to take 20 years of my father's life for $432 and sell it to a railroad company. He was going to, Chester said. The past tense was specific enough that Mamie looked at him sharply. Chester reached inside his jacket and produced the sealed envelope. He held it out to her. I went to Cornelius Hatch at the cattleman's first thing this morning. $450. It covers the full loan amount with enough margin to settle any fees Prout tries to add. Mamie stared at the envelope. She did not take it. Chester. The bank opens at 8:30, Chester said. I was there when the doors unlocked. I was going to go straight to Prout's office and put this on his desk before he had a chance to begin whatever process he's got planned for today, but I thought I should come here first. I thought you should know. You withdrew your savings, Mamie said. It was not phrased as a question, but it contained one, and the question was enormous. I did, Chester said simply. Why? The word came out smaller than she intended, carrying more weight than she had planned, and she felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the specific bewilderment of being shown unexpected kindness when you have braced yourself for difficulty. Chester looked at her, and the morning light was full on his face now, honest and uncomplicated, and he said, because I've been saving that money for something permanent. And I couldn't think of anything more permanent than making sure this land doesn't get taken from you. Mamie looked at the envelope for a long time. She looked at the land beyond the fence, at the creek and the dry grass in the barn where Bess was probably wondering why her morning routine had been interrupted, and she thought about what it meant to accept what was in that envelope and what it meant to refuse it. This is every dollar you have, she said. It's what I've got, Chester agreed. I'll earn more. I cannot take your savings, Chester Warren. You're not taking anything, he said. I'm offering it. That's different. It is a great deal of money. It is, he said. I know it. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, which said something in itself. Mamie was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 9 months learning that being alone on a farm with a debt she did not fully understand was an education in exactly the kind of world her father had tried to protect her from. She was not a woman who asked for help easily. She was not a woman who accepted dependence gracefully. But she was also not a fool, and the man standing on her porch with an envelope of savings and 3 weeks of trail dust on his jacket was not offering her charity. He was offering her something she did not yet have a precise word for, and she found that she wanted, very badly, to find out what that word was. Come with me, she said, to the bank. I want to be there when you hand it to Prout. Something shifted in Chester's expression, something that might have been relief, and he nodded. They rode into town together on their respective horses, Mamie on her bay mare Clara, Chester on Copper, and the distance between them on the road was proper but not vast, and they talked as they rode. Not about the bank or the loan or Harland Prout's machinations, but about other things, the kind of other things that people talk about when they are both aware of a larger conversation happening underneath the surface of the words, and are not quite ready to bring it fully into the light. Chester told her about the cattle drive, about the country along the Rio Grande in the late season, about a canyon he had ridden through that had walls the color of rusted copper, and a silence so complete he had stopped his horse just to listen to it. Mamie told him about the farm, about the garden she had expanded in the spring, about a litter of barn cats that Bess the cow had apparently appointed herself guardian of. They laughed once about something small, and the laugh sounded easy and natural in the morning air, which surprised them both. Harlan Prout arrived at the First Territorial Bank at approximately 20 minutes past 8, and he found, to his visible displeasure, that Chester Warren and Mamie Lockhart were already seated in the waiting area. Prout was a man in his mid-50s, heavy through the middle, with the particular bearing of a person who has spent decades cultivating the appearance of authority. He was dressed well, as he always was, and his mustache was trimmed with the kind of precision that suggested a man who spent time in front of a mirror. He looked at Chester and Mamie with an expression that was professionally neutral but could not entirely suppress a flicker of something that, in a less composed man, might have registered as alarm. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "I wasn't expecting you until later today." "I imagine not," Mamie said pleasantly. Prout gestured them into his office, which was a room that smelled of furniture polish and ambition, and he settled himself behind his desk with the practiced ease of a man who understood the psychological advantage of furniture arrangement. Chester and Mamie sat in the chairs opposite him, and Chester produced the envelope and set it on the desk between them. $450, Chester said. "Full payment of the outstanding loan on the Lockhart property, plus margin for any additional fees or interest accumulation to the current date. Miss Lockhart requests a receipt showing the loan as paid in full and a return of any documentation held as collateral." Prout looked at the envelope. He looked at Chester. He looked at Mamie. Something moved behind his eyes that was calculating and not particularly pleasant. "The loan total," he said carefully, "with interest to date and the processing fee for the foreclosure notice already issued, comes to $439.60. "Then this covers it," Chester said, "with $10.40 remaining, which I assume you'll return to Miss Lockhart." Prout had the expression of a man who has been playing chess and found that the board has been rearranged while he was not looking. He counted the money from the envelope with slow deliberateness, as though hoping to find an error, and found none. He wrote the receipt with the mechanical precision of a man performing a task he would very much prefer not to be performing, and he stamped it with the bank's official seal and slid it across the desk, along with the loan documentation marked paid, and $10.40 in coin. "The Lockhart property loan is satisfied," he said. The words sounded as though they cost him something. Mamie picked up the receipt and the returned documents and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Prout," she said, with a courtesy so complete it contained within it a kind of dignity that could not be challenged. She looked at him for exactly one moment in a way that let him know, without a word being said, that she understood precisely what he had attempted and precisely why he had failed. And then she turned and walked out of his office, and Chester followed her. They stepped out into the October sunlight of Redemption Creek's Main Street, and Mamie stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the paid documents in her hand, and Chester stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "It's done," Chester said finally. Mamie drew a breath that started at the very bottom of her lungs and expanded all the way up, and for a moment her eyes were very bright. She would not cry on the main street of Redemption Creek where any number of people might see her. That was simply not who she was. But she allowed herself that one breath, that one full exhale of 10 months of grief and worry, and waking up at 3 in the morning with her heart racing. "It's done," she agreed. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, giving her the moment without making it into something she would have to manage, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last time that day, that Chester Warren was a man who understood how to be present without being intrusive, which was a rarer quality than most people recognized. "I need to repay you," she said. "You don't," he said. "I do," she said firmly. I am not a woman who accepts $450 as a gift, Chester. I won't be able to pay it back all at once, but I want to make a formal arrangement, payments over time, and I want it written down properly so we both have a record. Chester looked at her then, and the look had something in it that was more than the situation strictly required, something that had been building since the moment he had heard those two voices in the alley and had felt the specific quality of the thing that moved through his chest. There might be another way to think about it, he said, and the sentence came out more carefully than he had intended. Mamie met his eyes. What other way? She asked, and her voice was steady, but her heart was doing something that had very little to do with steady. Chester put his hat back on and looked down the street for a moment, and Mamie had the impression of a man who had thought about saying something for a long time and was now deciding whether the moment was right, and concluding that there was never going to be a more right moment than this one. I've been working Hargrove's trail for 9 years, he said. I've got a good reputation and enough skill to find work anywhere in the territory, but I've been saving towards something of my own. He paused. The truth is, Miss Lockhart, I've been thinking about you for longer than I've had a reasonable excuse to, and this morning when I heard what Prude had planned, I didn't think about the money for even a second. I thought about you, about this land and what it means to you, and about the fact that no amount of Harlan Prude's scheming should be allowed to take it. Another pause. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it well enough, Mamie said quietly. What I mean is, Chester said, and now he did look at her fully and directly, that I would very much like the opportunity to be more than a man who rides past your fence occasionally and tips his hat, if you're open to it. The October sun was warm on the boardwalk, and the town around them was going about its morning business. And Mamie Lockhart looked at Chester Warren and thought about 20 minutes at the feed merchants, and a letter of condolence that had arrived on the trail and had been so carefully worded that she had read it several times, and about a man who had ridden to her bank before she had even woken up and had spent his savings without hesitation. She thought about what permanence looked like and what loneliness looked like, and how the distance between those two things sometimes collapsed in a single morning. I think, she said, that you had better come for supper tonight. The smile that crossed Chester Warren's face then was not a large smile. It was the particular kind of smile that belongs to a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been told he can set it down. Yes, ma'am, he said. He rode back out to the Lockhart property with her that morning, and she put him to work because Mamie Lockhart was not a woman who let a man sit idle when there were things to be done, and she was also smart enough to know that letting Chester be useful was a more honest thing than letting him sit on the porch making conversation. She had a fence post that had worked loose along the north pasture, and the barn needed its hinge repaired on the large door, and there was a section of the chicken coop that had developed a gap large enough for a fox to investigate. Chester went through all 3 tasks with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent his life working with his hands, and Mamie watched him from across the yard when she thought he was not paying attention and thought about what it would mean to not be alone in this. She made dinner at midday, thick stew from the rabbit she had snared yesterday and cornbread she was proud of, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and the conversation that started was not the same conversation they had been having on the road into town. It went deeper. Chester asked about her father, and Mamie talked about Thomas Lockhart in the way she had not allowed herself to talk about him with anyone, the specific and particular way he had loved this land, the way he used to walk the fence line in the evenings just to check on it, the stories he told about building the house, the way he sang hymns off-key when he thought no one could hear him. Chester listened the way he did everything, with his full attention and without any apparent sense that the conversation needed to be redirected toward something lighter. And then Mamie asked about Chester's father, and Chester talked about him with the same frankness, about the horse breeding operation that had been his father's dream and its collapse, about the good saddle that was all that remained of it, about learning that a man could lose a thing, and still carry the best parts of it with him. "Is that what you saved for?" Mamie asked. "Something of your own, like what your father had?" "Something like it," Chester said. "I never could quite picture it complete. I always got to the land and the horses, and then it would sort of blur at the edges." "What do you mean, blur?" He looked at her across the table. "I could never see who was in the picture with me," he said. "It just kept coming up empty on that part." Mamie looked at her stew. A moment passed. "And now?" she asked. Chester was quiet for a breath. "It's coming in clearer," he said. After the midday meal, Chester went to the stable to look at her horses. He had an eye for horseflesh that was almost diagnostic, and he spent 20 minutes with her bay mare Clara, and then another 10 with the second horse. A spotted gelding her father had called preacher for reasons that had never been entirely explained, and he made some observations about preacher's left rear shoe and Clara's feed that were practical and specific and useful. Mamie stood in the barn doorway watching him with the horses, and thought about the fact that he had been awake since before dawn the previous day, and had ridden through most of the night, and had then managed a bank transaction that saved her property and fixed 3 things around her farm without once appearing to use the exhaustion as a reason to stop. And she thought that there was a particular kind of character that revealed itself not in the big moments, but in the accumulated evidence of small ones. "Chester," she said. He looked up from examining preacher's shoe. "You need to sleep," she said. "There's a cot in the back room that my father used to use for the hands during harvest. It's made up. You cannot ride back to wherever you're staying in town on that amount of sleep without it being a danger to both you and Copper." Chester looked as though he was going to argue on principle, and then looked as though he recognized that she was entirely correct, and then looked slightly grateful in the way that men look when they are allowed to accept care without having had to ask for it. "I'll just rest a few hours," he said. "Rest as long as you need to," Mamie said. "Supper's at 6. He slept for 4 hours. Mamie worked the garden and checked the creek, and did the mending she had been putting off for 2 weeks, and tried, with only partial success, not to think too deliberately about the man sleeping in the back room. When she heard him moving around at 4:30, she put the kettle on for coffee. Chester came into the kitchen looking rested and slightly self-conscious about having slept in her house, and Mamie handed him a mug and told him the coffee was fresh, and showed him where the wash basin was, and they went about the ordinary business of the late afternoon with the comfortable ease of people who have somehow already passed through the awkward stage without noticing it. Supper was more elaborate than the midday meal, because Mamie was a good cook, and she had decided that a man who had spent 3 weeks on a cattle drive and then ridden through the night and spent his savings without blinking deserved something better than convenience. She made salt pork with gravy and boiled potatoes, and the last of her summer's canned green beans and a pie from dried apples that she had been keeping for an occasion worth the sugar. Chester ate with the appreciation of a man who had been living on trail food and camp bread for 21 days, and told her the pie was the best he had eaten since he could remember, which made Mamie wonder about the women in his life, and then made her immediately dismiss the wondering as none of her business, and then made her conclude, privately, that it might be her business eventually. After supper, they sat on the porch in the cooling evening air. The sky was enormous and clear, the kind of Texas sky that shows you the stars before dark has fully fallen, and the creek made its small, steady sound in the distance, and the crickets were starting up in the grass, and Mamie thought that this was what the land sounded like when it was not under threat, when it was simply itself, and that the sound was better than she had remembered it being. "I want to talk about the money," she said. "Mamie," he started. "Chester," she said, with exactly enough firmness to make him stop. "I understand what you did, and I am grateful for it in a way I don't have words big enough to carry, but I am not comfortable with the arrangement as it stands. You spent your savings on my behalf, and I want it to be an honest thing between us, not a gift I didn't ask for that sits between us and gets complicated." Chester was quiet for a moment. "What would make it honest?" he asked. "An arrangement," she said. I can pay you back in installments. The farm turns a modest profit in a good year. It won't be fast, but it will be steady." "I don't want your farm's profit," Chester said. "Then what do you want?" She asked, and the question was more direct than she had planned, and she felt it land in the space between them with a weight she had not fully anticipated. Chester turned to look at her. In the evening light his face was very clear, the trail-worn tiredness almost gone now after the sleep, and what remained was the particular expression of a man who has decided that a moment requires honesty and is going to deliver it regardless of whether that is comfortable. "I want to know whether there's something here," he said, "between you and me, whether what I've been carrying around for the past 3 years is something that goes only one direction or whether it goes two." Mamie did not look away. She had not expected him to say it so directly, and she found that she was glad he had, because she was a direct person herself and found indirectness exhausting. "It goes too," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that is full of the recalculation of possibilities, the sudden expansion of what a future might look like when a crucial piece of information has just been confirmed. "Then let's start there," Chester said, "and see what it grows into, and when it grows into something we'll figure out what's fair." Mamie nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "but I'm keeping track of what I owe you, just so it's clear." "You can keep whatever track you like," Chester said, and the faintest edge of amusement was in his voice. "Don't laugh," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "That's one of the things about you." She looked at him. "One of the things," she repeated. "How many things are there?" "I've been collecting them for 3 years," he said. "There's a fair number." The evening deepened around them, and the stars came fully out, and the moon, nearly full, laid silver light across the dry grass in the creek, and they talked for 2 more hours about everything and nothing, about the territory and its changes, about the railroad and what it was doing to the land and the people, about what Redemption Creek had been when they were young and what it was becoming, about horses and cattle and weather, and the specific quality of Texas silence that was not silence at all, but a layering of sounds that you had to learn to hear separately. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of them marking exactly when it happened, they stopped being a man and a woman who knew each other at a courteous distance and became something else, something that did not yet have a name but had a shape that both of them recognized. He rode back into town that night because propriety in 1882 was a thing with teeth, and Mamie stood at the gate and watched him go and thought that the day had begun with a foreclosure notice under her door, and was ending with the most thoroughly altered feeling she had carried in as long as she could remember. In the weeks that followed, Chester came to the farm in the evenings after fulfilling his remaining obligations to the Hargrove outfit, which included 2 more weeks of work before his contract period ended. He came on Copper along the road from town in the late afternoons, and Mamie always knew he was coming before she saw him, because she had learned the sound of Copper's particular trot. Slightly heavier on the left than the right due to an old injury the horse had recovered from but never entirely forgotten. He would help with whatever needed helping, and they would eat together, and they would sit on the porch or walk along the creek in the early dark, and the courtship, because that was what it was, had the quality that Mamie imagined proper things were supposed to have, which was the feeling of something being built carefully and with attention to the foundation. He brought her things sometimes. Not expensive things. He was not a man who expressed feeling through expenditure, but things that required observation. A small bunch of late-season wildflowers from a patch along the road that he had noticed, because he had been paying attention to the landscape in the way that people pay attention when they are looking for things that might please someone specific. A piece of quartz he had found near the creek with a vein of something that caught the light and that he had thought, correctly, she would think was beautiful. Once, a book of poetry from the general store that he had spotted while buying supplies and had stood in the aisle reading 2 pages of before deciding it was exactly the sort of thing she would like, which it was. Mamie gave things back in the language she understood best, which was care. She mended his jacket, the left sleeve of which had developed a tear he had not mentioned, and which she had simply noticed and repaired without comment. She made food that she knew he specifically liked based on things he had said in passing, because she paid attention the same way he did. She saved him coffee when he came in the mornings on weekends, the kind of consideration that is small in execution and large in implication. Deckard Sims, the bank clerk who had been overheard by Chester in the alley, turned out to have been more forthcoming with information than was professionally appropriate. And this eventually came to the attention of other people in town who were less comfortable with Harlan Pruitt's methods than they had previously let on. Two other families in the county had had similar experiences with loans that had been allowed to accrue beyond reason, and Chester, who was not a man given to public action, but who believed in justice with the quiet intensity of someone who has seen its absence, spent a week collecting their information and writing a careful account of everything, which he submitted to the county land commissioner's office in December. He was not alone in this. Cornelius Hatch at the Cattlemen's Savings Institution contributed his own professional assessment of the loan terms, and the land commissioner, a man named Rutherford Blaine who took his position seriously, opened a formal inquiry into the First Territorial Bank's lending practices. The inquiry took 3 months, during which Harlan Pruitt maintained his position with the particular confidence of a man who believes his influence is greater than the law's reach. He was wrong about this. In March of 1883, Rutherford Blaine's inquiry concluded with findings that were made a matter of public record, and the First Territorial Bank's charter in the county was suspended pending a review of its lending practices. The two other families whose loans had been similarly manipulated received formal settlements. Harlan Pruitt resigned his position and left Redemption Creek sometime in early April, and no one held a farewell gathering. Chester told Mamie about the conclusion of the inquiry on a Wednesday evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table where he had eaten at least 60 suppers by that point, and she listened with her hands flat on the table and her eyes very steady, and when he finished she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "My father would have been glad of that." "I think so," Chester said. "He never knew how to fight that kind of thing," Mamie said. "He wasn't a man for paperwork or institutions. He just worked the land and trusted that being honest was enough protection." "It should have been," Chester said. "Yes," she said, "it should have been." It was in November, 7 weeks after the evening on the porch when the direction of things had been established, that Chester asked to speak to Mamie formally, which she found slightly amusing, because the formality between them had largely dissolved into something warmer and more comfortable. But she understood what the formality was for. He came on a Sunday afternoon, which was itself unusual because his weekday visits had been the established pattern, and he was wearing his good shirt under his jacket, and his hat was clean. And Mamie took one look at him when he came up the porch steps and felt something warm move through her chest. They sat in the parlor because November had made the porch too cold for extended conversation, and the small stove in the corner of the room sent out its steady warmth, and the afternoon light came through the window and settled on the braided rug that had been Mamie's mother's work. Chester held his hat in his hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at her with the directness she had come to rely on. "I want to talk about the future," he said. "All right," she said. "My contract with Hargrove ends in December," he said. "I've been looking at a piece of land 2 miles north of here that's for sale, 30 acres. Good grazing, a creek runoff, a small house that needs work but has good bones. I could afford it with what's left in my savings and what I'll earn through December." He paused. "I could run horses there. I know horses. It's what my father knew and it's what I know best." Mamie watched him. She was very still. "What I'm saying," Chester continued, "is that I'm not planning to go anywhere. I'm planning to be here, and I want to know whether the future I'm planning is something you'd want to be part of." He looked at her fully. "I'm asking you to marry me, Mamie." Not because of the loan or the land or anything, except the plain fact that I love you and I can't picture the future without you in it, and I don't want to try. The fire in the small stove made its quiet sound in the corner of the room. Outside, the November wind moved through the dry grass. Mamie looked at Chester Warren, at the good and honest face of him, at the way he held his hat in his hands like a man who has laid everything down and is waiting to see what comes back, and she thought about everything she knew of him. The savings and the bank and the pre-dawn riding and the fence post and the barn hinge and the book of poetry and the wildflowers and 60 suppers and 3 months of evenings, and the fact that when he listened to her, he listened with his whole self, and when he worked with care, and when he felt something he said it plainly without decoration or evasion. "Yes," she said. "Chester, yes." He let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time, and the relief in it made her want to laugh, which she did, a small and genuine laugh, and then he smiled, the full smile this time, not the careful one, and he put his hat on the table and crossed the small distance between them and took her hands in both of his. And they sat like that for a moment in the warm room with the November wind outside and the stove ticking in the corner. And Mamie thought that this was what the word home was supposed to feel like. Not the land or the building, but the particular quality of being exactly where you were supposed to be. They were married in the spring, in April of 1883, when the wildflowers were coming in along the creek, and the Texas sky had that particular blue that belongs only to April and only to open country. The ceremony was held at the Redemption Creek Church, which was a small building but a solid one, and the pews were full because both of them had been in this community long enough to matter to it. Cornelius Hatch was there, and the families whose loan disputes Chester had helped bring to light, and the woman who ran the general store, and several of the Hargrove Ranch hands who had come in from the trail specifically for the occasion, and a number of townspeople who had simply decided that the marriage of Chester Warren and Mamie Lockhart was something worth witnessing. Mamie wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her and freshened with new white ribbon at the collar, and her dark hair was put up with pins she had borrowed from the woman at the general store. And when she walked down the aisle, she was looking straight at Chester with the directness that was simply who she was. And Chester, standing at the front of the church in his best clothes with his hat held properly in his hands, looked back at her with an expression that made Cornelius Hatch clear his throat and look at the ceiling. The pastor, a man of middle years named Elias Garvey, who believed in keeping ceremonies honest rather than elaborate, spoke about partnership and steadiness, about the specific quality of love that endures difficulty and grows stronger for it rather than weaker, and his words fell accurately on the people they were meant for. Chester's voice was level when he spoke his vows, and Mamie's was clear, and when Elias Garvey declared them married, the sound that went through the church was warm and genuine and had nothing of performance in it. The celebration afterward was at the farm, because where else would it be? And the farm looked exactly right for it. The spring grass coming green along the creek, the apple tree in the yard that Mamie's father had planted beginning its annual bloom, the chickens in the yard moving through the afternoon with their usual self-important calm. Tables had been set up in the yard, and food had been contributed by half the guests, and Chester had brought out a fiddle player from town, who was responsible for a great deal of the afternoon's happiness. Chester danced with Mamie 3 times before anyone else had a chance to ask her, which was not quite within the strict etiquette of the occasion, but which everyone present agreed was entirely in keeping with the spirit of the day. He danced the way he did most things, with attention and without self-consciousness, and Mamie danced with her hand in his, and thought that this was better than she had known to hope for. Chester had purchased the 30 acres north of the farm in January, and through the spring and summer of their first married year, he worked on building the horse operation while also helping Mamie manage the farm. This was not a simple thing, managing 2 adjacent properties simultaneously, and there were weeks that were hard, weeks when the weather was wrong or the horse buyers didn't materialize, or the farm's fence needed replacing in 3 places at once. But the difficulty of it was the shared kind, which is an entirely different thing from difficulty born alone, and Mamie found that having someone to think through a problem with made even the worst of the problems feel more manageable. They consolidated eventually, combining the 2 properties into one operation that ran horses on Chester's 30 acres and kept the farm's cattle and garden going on Mamie's 40, which made for a property of 70 acres total, with a creek running through the eastern quarter, and a view from the south fence that on clear days went all the way to the canyon walls in the distance. Chester's horse operation built steadily, because he was skilled and careful, and his reputation in the territory was good, and within 2 years he had a waiting list for his trained horses that would have surprised him if he had not worked so deliberately to earn it. The house, the one Mamie's father had built, was the center of it all, and Chester added to it in the 2nd year of their marriage. A larger kitchen because Mamie's cooking had grown into something that required more space, and a room on the east side that he built with the particular care of a man who is building something for a specific future purpose. A room with a good window, and a floor he sanded 3 times until he was satisfied with the smoothness of it. Mamie watched him build it and said nothing about what she understood it was for, because it felt like the kind of hope that should be allowed to develop without being spoken aloud until it was ready. In the autumn of their 2nd year together, Mamie told Chester that the east room was going to be needed. He was in the barn brushing down a young gray mare when she came and told him, and the look that crossed his face was something she kept in her memory for the rest of her life, a look of such complete and uncomplicated joy that it bypassed all his usual composure and arrived fully on his face without any of his characteristic steadiness moderating it. He set down the brush and crossed the barn in 4 steps and took her face in both his hands the way he had taken her hands in the parlor that November afternoon, and he said, "Mamie," just her name, as though the name was sufficient to carry everything he meant, and she thought that it probably was. Their son arrived in the spring of 1885, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's directness of expression, which announced itself very early in a gaze that seemed to be evaluating the world and finding it adequate. They named him Thomas Chester Warren, Thomas for the grandfather whose hands had built the house and whose name should be carried forward in it, and Chester because Mamie felt that if the boy was going to bear a legacy, it should be from both sides. Chester accepted this with the particular combination of humility and quiet pride that characterized him, and he spent a great deal of the boy's first weeks sitting in the east room with a lamp burning low, holding a sleeping infant and thinking about things he did not say aloud, but that Mamie could read in his expression when she came to the doorway. Thomas grew, as children in those years and in that country tended to grow, fast, and with the particular toughness of children who live outdoors and understand early that the world is large and mostly indifferent to their preferences. He was a good boy, curious in the way that his mother was curious and steady in the way that his father was steady, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was already following Chester through the horse paddock with the expression of a child who has decided that horses are the most important thing in the world, which was fine with Chester. The farm in those years had a quality that Mamie sometimes stopped in the middle of a task just to notice. The sound of the horses in the north paddock, Thomas's voice from wherever he had gotten to in the yard, Chester's whistle from the barn or the fence line, the creek in the east, the chickens conducting their ongoing business in their particular corner of the world, the apple tree in the yard that bloomed in April and gave fruit in October, the garden that her mother had planted and that Mamie had tended and expanded until it supplied not only the household but occasionally the neighbors as well. The house that her father had built board by board and that Chester had added to with the same care, so that the additions matched the original in a way that looked intended rather than appended. Mamie kept a kitchen garden that had become something of a local institution, because she had a gift for growing things that had always been hers even as a girl. And by 1886, she was supplying the general store with preserved vegetables through the winter months, which added a reliable income stream to the household that she took a quiet professional pride in. Chester had expanded his horse training operation, by then to include a young man of 19 named Eli Beaumont, a local boy with a good hand with animals who was learning the trade, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he would eventually be very good at it. Chester was a patient teacher, which surprised no one who knew him and which was, Mamie privately thought, simply another face of the quality that had shown itself the morning he had waited outside a bank for it to open. In the summer of 1887, when Thomas was 2.5 and already showing alarming confidence around horses that were significantly larger than he was, Mamie told Chester that the East Room was going to be needed again. He was sitting on the porch this time, going over his accounts for the horse sales, and he looked up from his papers, and the expression was the same as the first time, completely unmediated by his usual composure. He set the papers on the table without marking his place, which told her everything about his state of mind, and he stood up and gathered her against him, and she could feel him laughing, which was itself a rare enough occurrence that she treasured it. Their daughter arrived that winter, the first week of December, during a cold snap that had the creek iced at the edges and the horses breathing fog in the paddock. She was small and fierce, and had from the first hour of her life an expression of complete determination that made the doctor who delivered her say, with some surprise, that he had not seen a newborn look quite so decided about things. They named her Clara Rose Warren, Clara for Mamie's bay mare who had been Mamie's companion through the hard months before Chester had come back into her life, and Rose because Chester said it quietly when he was holding her for the first time, and it fit her so well that no other name was seriously considered. Clara grew into the exact person her first expression had promised. She was bold where Thomas was measured, loud where Thomas was quiet, and she had decided by age 3 that she could ride anything in the paddock, which required a degree of parental vigilance that Chester described, in one of his driest moments, as a full-time occupation in itself. Mamie adored both her children with the same fierce competence she brought to everything, and Chester loved them with the steady depth that was simply how he loved things. The land inquiry that Chester had helped initiate in late 1882 had longer consequences than even he had anticipated. The suspension of the First Territorial Bank's charter had been replaced by a reorganization under new management, and the new manager, a fair-minded man from Austin named William Carey, had taken an interest in the equitable treatment of farmers in the county. Chester had appeared before Carey's initial community meeting in 1883 and spoken plainly about what he had observed, and his testimony had contributed to a revised set of county lending standards that, while not perfect, were considerably more honest than what Harland Pruitt had operated under. This was not something Chester spoke about often or took credit for, but Mamie knew it had happened, and she knew what it had cost him in time and energy, and she kept that knowledge alongside everything else she knew about him. Life in Redemption Creek in the later years of the 1880s was the ordinary life of people who have found their proper place and are living it with attention. There were good years and harder years, as there always were in cattle country, years when the weather was right and the horse sales were strong and the garden gave abundantly, and years when the creek ran low and the buyers were scarce, and one of the horses had to be sold at a loss to cover the winter provisions. Through both kinds of years, the particular quality of the house remained constant, which was the quality of a home in the fullest sense, not merely a structure but a living place where specific people had made specific choices and were continuing to make them. Thomas, at 6, had developed a passion for horses that had moved beyond even Chester's with its long professional history, and he could tell you the particular characteristics of every horse in the paddock, and had opinions about their training that were, Chester admitted to Mamie one evening, occasionally correct. Clara, at 4, had discovered that she could get into the chicken coop by going through a specific loose board at the back, and she had a relationship with the chickens that Mamie found both admirable and slightly concerning in its intensity. Chester, at 34, had the particular ease of a man who has found his right life and is living it, an ease that was not complacency, but rather the deep-rootedness of someone who has stopped moving because he has arrived. He still worked hard, harder than most men would consider comfortable, because the horse operation and the farm between them required a great deal, but the work had the quality of work done for something that belongs to you, which is a different quality entirely from work done for wages. Mamie, at 32, was a woman who had grown into her own strength, the way a tree grows into its full height, not suddenly but with the accumulation of seasons. She had the farm her father had built, and she had the man she had chosen, and she had 2 children who were turning out to be exactly themselves, which was the best thing children could be. And she had the particular satisfaction of a person who has faced a serious threat to everything they love, and has come out the other side with that everything intact and added to. On an October evening in 1889, 7 years almost exactly from the morning of the foreclosure notice, Mamie was in the kitchen putting up the last of the fall's apple preserves when Chester came in from the paddock with Thomas on his shoulders, and Clara attached to his left leg in a manner that did not appear to be impeding his ability to walk, which said something about both his general stability and his patience. He set Thomas down and detached Clara with the practiced ease of long experience, and came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe in the way he had always done, watching her work. "What?" she said, without turning around because she always knew when he was watching. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She put the lid on the last jar and turned around, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at him across the kitchen. Thomas had gone to find the barn cat, which was a recent obsession, and Clara had followed him, which was a constant fact of her life. The kitchen was warm and smelled of apples and cinnamon, and the good dense smell of the stove, and the evening light was coming in at the window at the particular angle that October evenings had, all gold and long, and Chester was leaning in the doorframe exactly as he had leaned in it every evening for 7 years. "Chester Warren," she said. "Mamie Warren," he said. "What were you thinking about just now?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to questions that deserved it. "That morning," he said, "7 years ago. The foreclosure notice," she said. "The alley," he said, "and the bank, and riding out here and seeing you at the fence with the sun on your face." A pause, and thinking that whatever I did next was probably going to matter for the rest of my life. Mamie crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and looked up at him with the directness that had always been hers, that dark, steady gaze that had looked at him across a porch railing 7 years ago in the October morning and seen him completely. "It did," she said. "It did," he agreed. She put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, the gesture she had made 1,000 evenings in 7 years, and he covered her hand with his. And outside in the yard she could hear Thomas and Clara arguing about something in the specific tone of siblings who are fully engaged in the argument but not actually upset by it. And the creek made its evening sound, and the October sky outside the kitchen window was the deep clear blue of an evening that has decided to be perfect. And the horses moved in the paddock with their quiet, deliberate weight, and the apple tree in the yard stood in its October state, bare of leaves and bearing its last fruit, having given everything it had to give, for another season. "I was thinking," Chester said, "about the East Room." Mamie looked at him. "It's been a while," he said carefully, "since it was needed. The smile that came to Mamie's face then was the one that Chester had been collecting for 7 years, the one that started at the corner of her mouth and moved through her whole expression like light moving through water, and she said, "Well, Chester, you might want to check on it again in the spring." He stared at her for a moment, and then his composure, which had weathered cattle drives and bank confrontations and county inquiries, and the demands of parenthood and 7 years of Texas weather, failed entirely, and he pulled her in and held her in the warm kitchen in the October evening, while outside their children made the sounds of children who are entirely and completely at home in the world they have been given. The spring came, as it always did, with wildflowers along the creek and the apple tree in bloom, and the horses standing in the new grass with their heads up at the mild wind that came from the south. And in the east room with its good window and its 3 times sanded floor, a third voice added itself to the sounds of the Warren household, a son they named James, who arrived in April as though specifically arranged to coincide with the best of the season, and who was, from his first hour, exactly the continuation of something that had begun on an October morning, when a man had ridden to a bank before a woman had even woken up, and had found, in the act of saving something, everything he had been saving for. Thomas was 4 and Clara was 2 when James arrived, and they received him with the particular intensity of children receiving a new sibling, which is to say, Thomas studied him with serious scientific interest, and Clara immediately announced that she was going to teach him to ride when he was ready, which was not a timeline anyone else in the family considered realistic, but which no one attempted to discourage because Clara's conviction on the matter was not the kind that responded well to discouragement. Chester stood in the east room that first evening with James in his arms, the lamp on the bedside table sending its warm, steady light across the floor, and Mamie watched from the bed where she was propped against the pillows looking at both of them, her husband and her 3rd child, and she thought about everything the room represented, the hope that had built it, the mourning that had made all of it possible. The man who had spent his savings on a February dawn for reasons that had not yet been fully articulated but had been perfectly understood. Outside the house, the April night was soft. The creek ran clear and full with the spring melt from the canyon, and the horses moved in the paddock with their usual quiet dignity, and the chickens were settled in their coop with Clara's section of loose board still carefully not repaired, because Mamie had decided that Clara's relationship with the chickens was worth the occasional disruption, and the apple tree stood in the full extravagance of its spring bloom, white blossoms against the April dark. The whole tree lit up like something that had decided to be beautiful, as seriously as a thing can decide anything. Chester looked up from James and found Mamie watching him, and the look between them had in it everything that 7 years of a shared life contains, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the hard seasons and the good ones, the morning of the foreclosure notice and the evening of the apple preserves, and every meal and every fence post, and every conversation on the porch and every dance at every celebration. All of it compressed into the single clear fact of 2 people who had found each other in the specific circumstances that had been theirs, and had made of those circumstances something permanent. "Hello, James," Chester said quietly to the sleeping baby in his arms. "This is going to be a good place for you." And Mamie, watching the 2 of them in the lamplight of the east room with the sound of the April creek outside, and the smell of the apple blossoms coming through the window, thought that her father, walking the fence line of this land in the evenings, checking on what he had built, would have looked at this room, and this man and these children, and he would have understood, with the particular certainty of someone who loved a piece of ground with his whole heart, that the land had been worth saving, that every board he had laid, and every fence post he had set had been reaching forward toward exactly this. The 40 acres her father had built and the 30 acres Chester had bought, and the 70 acres they had made of them together lay outside under the April stars, holding everything they had planted in it, and would hold it for a long time to come. and Chester Warren, who had ridden to a bank in the pre-dawn dark of an October morning 7 years past, stood in the room he had built for this purpose, and held his youngest child and looked at his wife, and thought that the money had been the easiest thing he had ever spent, and that the return on it had been beyond any calculation he had been capable of making at the time, and that if he had it to do again, he would ride faster. Mamie saw him thinking it because she always saw what he was thinking, and she smiled at him across the lamplit room, and he smiled back, and the east room held them all, and the April night held the farm, and the farm held the creek and the horses and the apple tree and the chickens and the memory of everything it had taken to keep them all. And outside in the world beyond the fence, Redemption Creek went on about its business in the late spring dark, ordinary and ongoing. Exactly as a place should be when the people in it have made their peace with it.